Okay.
Is that good? Sure, I'm gonna ask Leah. Is there, should she email you?
I'll be in touch. Yeah, email would be great, but if she's posting it somewhere.
Okay, so let me ask her the best way to send it to you. I'll do that right now.
Okay, great. I want to know also if I can get.
So we can
Yeah, I usually, it's twice a year and then twice now. So if she has access to it, that would be great.
Let me ask her right now.
Okay, thank you so much.
How are we doing?
Yeah, we've been learning on Fridays. Yeah, it's afternoon for him, but it's the same time for me.
It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Of course. Yeah.
Right.
Does everybody online have access to the sources? They posted the sources?
Yeah.
Okay, just one more thing for Dr. Rubosi and take the floor. Thank you everybody so much who has registered, who is registering to send their support. This is the time for us in terms of making sure that we have the funding for next year. The founders, Lenny, Anthony, and Lamar, things like that, has really done an incredible job carrying the program for a long time, but it's going to be much more on us. We want people to see how the sector is. It's very doable, as long as we have 100% participation. Incredible thing, I can tell you, we require literally, but it's really important cause for us. We will register. I know a number of people in Congress, it's very busy time of year, but we appreciate everybody's support and having some extra flyers here. So please send in, you can register here, you can check that. You can mail them to this address as well. That we do, but most important thing for us is to get 100% participation in one form or another. One big job whose website is being marked, and that one of the things that we as always for being really one of the mainstays of our Jewish history program. In particular, make this Beit Midrash more accessible to an entire group of people. that, well, we have another Jewish history, and we're really thrilled to be able to offer it, and to be able to offer it really at a world level. Thanks so much, Professor Mermelstein, for making that not just an aspiration, but a reality for us. So often you make yourself. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the repeated invitations. The amount of Harbatzas Torah that you do here and in our community in general is admirable, is inspiring. So thank you. Thank you for everything you do on behalf of our community. Okay, the computer's going to need to charge at some point, but I don't actually see an outlet. Does anybody see an outlet anywhere in the room at this stage? Okay, so we'll see. It's possible that I may have to relocate at some point. I don't want to relocate yet because I don't want to. So, but if necessary, in the final minutes, I may need to. So we'll play it by ear. But in the meantime, let's get started. So everybody should hopefully have access to the source sheets. Who is not here when I spoke 2 weeks ago? Who is not here? Fine. Okay, so I needed to recap anyway to refresh everyone's memories. So, so here's a recap because what we're going to be talking about today, we'll see follows naturally from what we spoke about 2 weeks ago. Okay, so I don't remember exactly what the title of the talk was 2 weeks ago, but it had something to do with history's oldest form of hatred, anti-Semitism, and antiquity, something along those lines. And what I was trying to show then is that anti-Semitism in its oldest form is pre-Christian and is not what we technically refer to as anti-Semitism. When we talk about anti-Semitism, what we really mean is we mean a notion of biological difference between Jews and non-Jews. So it's an essentialized difference between Jews and non-Jews. It's an essentialized difference that is racial in nature, and that points to the fact that Jews are fundamentally inferior. That's what we mean when we talk about modern forms of anti-Semitism beginning in the 19th century. Before the 19th century, speaking about anti-Semitism is somewhat of a misnomer. Again, I'm using it just as a shorthand because we understand intuitively what anti-Semitism means, but more precisely, we're speaking about anti-Judaism. The anti-Judaism that we speak about in antiquity is important because it's older than Christianity. So we're talking about a period that precedes Christian anti-Judaism, that is therefore not based in theological polemics between Jews and Christians. And for that reason is important because what we see is that many of the kinds of bases upon which our non-Jewish neighbors have often opposed us recur, and they're not simply Christian in origin. That's going to become important so that we can really talk about almost 3 phases of anti-Judaism historically. We can talk about anti-Judaism that predates Christianity. We can talk about anti-Judaism that is really Christian in origin and that really endures into the 19th century and in many forms beyond. And anti-Semitism, which is really a phenomenon that we only hear about beginning in the 19th century. What's interesting is that in those 3 phases, we really see certain similarities that cross, and that's what's going to be important, not only for what our opponents have historically said about us in each of those 3 phases, but also the ways in which we have responded, because that's going to be the subject of my talk today, not really what forms did anti-Judaism take in antiquity, but rather what were the responses that Jews offered to anti-Judaism in antiquity. I will repeat, I'll take Joseph's question 1 second. I will recap what we spoke about last time because it will be an important precursor to what we're going to be talking about today. And then we'll jump right into the sources. Yeah, Joseph.
Started in 1948, which with the creation of the state of Israel, anti-Semitism more 2 times before.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair point. Yeah, I think that we can definitely talk about, even there, what would be interesting is that many of the points of opposition are similar, but I think that that's a fair point. I think that what we're talking about beginning in 1948 is probably a 4th phase. If we were to extend our discussion beyond 1948, I think we'd see that many of the points that I made last time and that we'll talk about today do extend even into that 4th phase. which is instructive because what it means is when we think about our circumstances today, these are not new phenomena, right? We need to think about them within a broader framework. What exactly that means, what the repercussions, what the lessons for us are, is not a discussion today, but I think it's worth thinking about why exactly they are instructive. But I think that's a fair point. Okay, so I'm not sure if there is. Yeah. So we can try to see if it extends. If not, I can move the extender over a little. See one. Let's just one behind the. Is there one behind the? No. Okay. Might actually extend, so that's great. Okay, so let's recap what we spoke about last time. Okay, so despite the differences that I just spoke about, there are striking similarities between the anti-Judaism of antiquity and the anti-Judaism that we see about in subsequent phases. We spoke about really 4 bases upon which pagan precursors to Christianity opposed Judaism. So let's just recap what we saw. We spoke about Jewish difference, and we'll get into the details as we go through the sources today. We spoke about Jewish difference. We spoke about Jewish hatred of humanity. That is Jewish misanthropy, the ways in which Jews were regarded as hating their non-Jewish neighbors. We spoke about charges of dual loyalty. So that is that even though, for the most part, we were talking about Jews living in the diaspora, even though Jews are living in Rome, in Alexandria, in Egypt, even further east, what we still find is Jews might be citizens, right? They might even be loyal citizens locally, but their loyalty really is split between Israel, between their co-religionists to, again, depending on where you're living, co-religious for the most part to the east, and whichever society they happen to be living in. So dual loyalty was a third. And then preferential treatment, we said, was the 4th basis upon which non-Jewish pagans opposed Jews. Okay, we're going to talk about some of the details, again, repeating them from what we saw last time. The other interesting thing that we're going to see today is that the basis for opposition, the basis for Jews responding to these objections aren't simply saying, for example, that Jews did not hate humanity, not simply saying that Jews were not different. What they're actually interestingly going to do is they're going to turn these arguments on their heads, so that not only were Jews not haters of humanity, Jews were the ultimate lovers of humanity. Not only were Jews not different, but Jews were the ultimate Greek. But that's going to be an interesting phenomenon that we're going to see today, the way in which we're not only neutralizing the objections, but actually turning them directly on their head. Okay, so let's get started with the first source. And again, as last week, I've broken down the sources into different categories. This first set of sources, Jews are not a misanthropic people, is going to respond to this claim that we looked at last time. Remember, the charge of misanthropy basically took the following form in terms of the sources that we looked at last time. It said, first of all, that in their origins, Jews are fundamentally hateful people. Remember, we saw the story about the Exodus, story of Yetzias Mitzrayim that is told. We looked at the source in Tacitus, the Roman writer of roughly a contemporary of Josephus. We said late 1st century CE, beginning of the 2nd century CE. The story that he tells of the Exodus is basically the Jews were expelled from Egypt because they were hated by the chief god of the Egyptians. Remember, the source that we looked at talks about the Jews as having been leprous, having taken refuge in the Egyptian temple, and the Egyptian god Ra, the sun god, became so incensed that he brought a plague upon the Egyptians. When the Egyptians realized what was going on, they expelled the Jews. And so therefore, the Jews in their origins were actually hated by the gods. They were forced to flee to the wilderness, where this person, Moses, where Moshe appears out of nowhere, right? He's just really one of the rank and file. He convinces the Jewish people that in the same way that they were hated by the Egyptians, they should reciprocate and hate outsiders as well. he invents this notion that there is one God and that this one God will come to their rescue. They then come and attack the people in Canaan, they attack the Canaanites and take over the land. According to this source, Tacitus and other writers like him, that sort of set the stage for everything that followed, that Jewish law fundamentally is a hateful system. So, for example, the text that we looked at talks about how Jews refused to eat with non-Jews, Jews refused to marry non-Jews, Jews ate by themselves and ate food that was different from everyone else. Jews circumcised themselves. And why did they do all of these things? Not only to be different, but also because they hated the outside world. The source goes on, the source in Tacitus, and again, that was just representative of other sources that we didn't look at. Tacitus talks about how that hate of humanity can account for why the Jews rebelled against the Romans in the year 66, leading up to Churban Bayit Sheni. Why did they rebel? Precisely because they hated all outsiders. That was just to recap some of what we saw about this charge of the Jews as hating humanity. Let's take a look at how Philo responds to this. So again, just to refresh everyone's memories about who Philo is, I mentioned two primary outbreaks of anti-Semitism, of anti-Judaism in antiquity. I said that for the most part, there was disdain, there was resentment toward the Jews on the grounds that I just mentioned, but really in terms of full-fledged violent responses to the Jews, we can talk about two primary phases or two primary events. One of the events was the first pogrom in the year 37 BCE, which took place in Alexandria in Rome. And the other was in the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple of Bayit Sheni in the year 70. Philo, we said, was one of the leading citizens in the Alexandrian community. He participates, really leads an embassy to the Roman emperor, who at that time was first Tiberius, then Gaius, then Claudius, to try to advocate on behalf of the Jews in the aftermath of this pogrom. And much of what Philo has to say in his various writings can really be understood as a response to these non-Jewish pagan accusations of misanthropy, of Jewish difference. And much of what Philo has to say is he turns to halacha in order to argue that Jews are actually not misanthropic, the Jews are actually not different, the Jews are actually lovers of humanity. So let's see what he has to say about Jews not being misanthropic. So let's start with the bolded sections on source 1. I'm sorry, let's actually start at the beginning of this passage. There is no bound or limit to the number of deities, male and female, honored in different cities. The vain inventions of the tribes of poets and of the great multitude of men to whom the quest for truth is a task of difficulty and beyond their powers of research. Namely, the non-Jews, the pagans of the world, have innumerable deities, and these deities basically are just inventions. So that's what he goes on to say in the bolded section that follows. When they went wrong in what was the most vital matter of all, it is the literal truth that the error with which the rest committed was corrected by the Jewish nation. So where did the pagans of the world go wrong? Pagans of the world went wrong basically in inventing deities who were of no bound or limit. And what was the function of the Jews? The function of the Jews was to correct for the mistakes committed by the non-Jews. What does that mean? So if we just go on in the passage, the Jewish nation, which passed over all created objects because they were, this is what the non-Jews did. They passed over all created objects because, this is what the Jews did, passed over all created objects because they were created and naturally liable to destruction, and chose the service only of the uncreated and eternal. So what the Jews did by turning to the one God was to correct for the mistakes of the non-Jews, basically turning to a multitude of gods rather than serving the one God. The idea that the Jews are correcting for the wrongs of the non-Jews is important, because what that means is that the Jews have a service that they are providing to the world at large. Meaning, if the world at large ignored the service of the one God, that would imperil the world at large. And so therefore, what the Jews have done is the Jews have corrected for those wrongs. And he goes on and basically says that explicitly in the final paragraph here. Philo says, and therefore it astonishes me to see that some people venture to accuse of inhumanity. Inhumanity, I said the Greek for hatred of humanity is misanthropia, right? Misanthropic, literally misos is hate, anthropos is humanity. So haters of humanity. It astonishes him that Jews are accused of being haters of humanity to a nation which has shown so profound a sense of fellowship and goodwill. The word for fellowship is philanthropia. So philos meaning love, philia meaning love, again, anthropos meaning humanity. So not only are Jews not haters of humanity, but they are actually lovers of humanity. By using how do they demonstrate their love of humanity? They use its prayers and festivals and first fruit offerings as a means of supplication for the human race in general, and of making its homage to the truly existent God. So what do Jews do? By serving the one God, what Jews are doing basically is demonstrating their love of humanity. How are they doing that? Because if no one served the creator God, the world would presumably be lost. And so remember what I said before about Tacitus basically charging the Jews with creating this notion of monotheism in response to the idea that the pagan gods hated the Jews. What Philo is basically saying is turning that claim on its head, saying that it's the Jews who are serving the one God, it's the pagans who have invented all of those other gods. And by serving the one God, the Jews aren't demonstrating their hatred, which is what the pagans claimed about the Jews, but rather they are demonstrating their love. They're demonstrating their affinity for the world, because if not for the Jews, the world would be lost. And so therefore, this accusation that the Jews hate humanity, that somehow monotheism demonstrates difference, and it demonstrates difference because the Jews want to turn to the one God because they hate the entire world, completely misconstrues the importance of monotheism for the benefit of the entire world. So what I said before is that what Philo is doing is turning these accusations on their head. And how is he doing that? Basically by saying monotheism actually illustrates love of humanity rather than hatred of humanity. Yeah, Joseph.
You try to convince the other side. So how are you convinced the pagan world that we love the world by saying we have a God and you don't, and we're right and you're wrong? If I were a pagan, I would not be convinced.
So right. So first of all, so that's an important point. So there are a couple of important observations to make. One is it's not clear, for example, when Philo writes this, is Philo speaking internally? So he's speaking, Jewish community at that point is facing these accusations. They might be in a position of mortal danger in the aftermath of this pogrom, and perhaps the decision that is going to come down from the emperor against the Jews. So it could be that arguments like this one are meant to fortify the Jews. So that is, the Jews shouldn't understand that, let's put it this way. Where does the notion of modern self-hatred, Jewish self-hatred come from? Jewish self-hatred is largely a notion of internalizing these accusations from the outside. That basically what outsiders have said is that Jews are haters of humanity. When Jews secularize to the point where they feel contempt toward their Judaism because they're accepting those accusations from the outside, that hatred becomes self-directed. That really is the origins of this notion of Jewish self-hatred. What Philo is trying to do is to fend off that response. Meaning what Jews might do is they might say, you know what? We are actually haters of humanity. They might take that claim seriously. So what the Jews need to do is they need to hear arguments that will serve as a counterpoint. So in a certain sense, he's speaking internally in order to fortify Jewish claims. I think that's probably the strongest reading of Philo, because you're right. Who exactly is Philo going to convince? That's one possibility. Another possibility, he's not going to convince his anti-Semitic opponents, right? It's clear. And now, who might his audience be? His audience might be a neutral audience, perhaps even a sympathetic audience. So if, for example, he's speaking to the emperor at this point, he goes to Rome, he's part of this embassy, he's speaking to Tiberius, to Gaius, to Claudius, what he might be trying to say to them is, even if I'm not going to be able to convince you, and you're not going to be able to regard us as lovers of humanity, at least you should understand that there is this counter position. So it might be that he's speaking not only internally, but also to a potentially sympathetic audience, not speaking to his opponents, because you're right, they're a lost cause, but to an audience that is pivotal here, right? Because what he needs Claudius, etc., what he needs him to do is to pass judgment on the Jews in a way that's more favorable, at least regarding the Jews as potentially lovers, even if this is not a completely decisive argument. So it's an important point, but I think that that's probably the way to read Philo. Okay, so let's go on to the next passage. Again, this is Philo responding to this claim of misanthropy and turning on its head the charges that non-Jews were leveling at the Jews. So what we saw last time is that there are a couple of Jewish practices in particular that non-Jews identified as demonstrating Jewish hatred. One of these practices, we said, was the observance of Shabbos. Why is it that Jews observe Shabbos? Jews observe Shabbos in order to segregate themselves, right? We don't want to be part of society, and so what do? We isolate ourselves one day out of 7. Another practice that the non-Jewish opponents identified was, by extension, the practice of Shemitah, namely that 1 year out of 7, the Jews want to segregate. The Jews don't want to provide for us, and therefore they don't work the land 1 year out of 7. Philo speaks about both of those. He speaks about both Shabbos and Shemitah, and what he's going to do is he's going to say not only do those practices not illustrate hatred, but to the contrary, they actually illustrate love, right? Not misanthropy, but rather philanthropy. So let's take a look at what Philo has to say here. So we're going to read actually both of these paragraphs. So, and again, with regard to the 7th year, one can without difficulty use much the same, though perhaps not identical words. What precedes this is Philo's argument about Shabbos, which we're going to come to later. It's important just to note what I said last time is Philo left behind a massive corpus of writing. We're really jumping around. Really, if you were to sort of survey Philo's various writings, he's making these arguments across much of this corpus, right? So that's just important to understand. So he says about Shemitah, with regard to the 7th year, one can without difficulty use much the same, though perhaps not identical words. For here it is not they themselves who abstain from work, as on those 7 days. So it's not that the Jews, on Shabbos, it's true that the Jews abstain from work. What do they do during Shemitah? It is the land which they leave idle against the days. And unfortunately, I left off the last few sentences. The argument that he goes on to make is that this is actually a sympathetic demonstration on the part of the Jews. In the same way that humans need to refresh themselves 1 day out of 7, the land needs to refresh itself 1 year out of 7. In the same way that people can only be productive if they take occasional rests, so too can the land only be productive if it remains fallow 1 year out of 7. The argument is not, it's to our benefit if we allow the land to become productive again by letting it remain fallow 1 year out of 7. His argument is we actually have a love for the land. If you love the land, you don't want to destroy the land by continuing to work it year after year, right? So that first argument is basically what we show is we show sympathy even for inanimate objects like the land. But he goes on and says, actually, Shemitah also demonstrates our love for humanity. We have truly great proof of their humanity. And again, every time that we find the word humanity today, it's always English for philanthropia, for love of humanity. So we have truly great proof of their humanity in the following also. Since they themselves abstain from labor during that year, meaning Jews abstain from labor, they think that they should not gather or lay by the fruits produced, which do not accrue to them from their own toil. But since God has provided them, sprung from the soil by its own action, they should grant them to be used freely by wayfarers and others who desire or need them. So Jews aren't going to eat any of the produce that grows on its own during the Shemitah year. What are they going to do? They're going to leave it available for passersby, not only Jewish passersby, but Gentile passersby as well. So what Shemitah also demonstrates is Jewish love for humanity. Jews are not only allowing the land to refresh itself, but they are also using the food that grows on its own. They are also allowing all passersby access to that food. And so therefore, Shemitah, not only is it not illustrative of hatred, but it is actually illustrative of love both for the land and for humanity at large. Okay, those are just a couple of examples of how Jews at this time are responding to this accusation of misanthropy. Let's look at how Philo responds to the charge that Jews are different. So remember, the Jewish difference was described in a number of ways. Again, the non-Jews specify certain laws that, according to them, illustrate Jewish difference, and Jewish difference that in a way is really in some ways antithetical to the Greek notion that we should all be one, right? Unity, there's no reason for difference. And they talked about, the sources that we talked about last time spoke about a number of practices. They spoke especially about the laws of kashrus, right? Kashrus not only are a way of Jews demonstrating their hatred for us, but they're also a way of Jews demonstrating difference. And they also spoke about Shabbos. Again, Shabbos not only is a way for the Jews to demonstrate their hatred, but also for Jews to demonstrate difference. So what I want to look at is, how is Philo going to respond in both of those contexts, both in his description of kashrus and his description of Shabbos, to this accusation that Jews are fundamentally different? Okay, he's not going to deny that there is this practice of kashrus, that there is this practice of Shabbos, and that these practices are unique to the Jews, right? He's not going to deny that. Let's instead see the argument that he advances. Okay, so Philo has the following to say about Jews refraining from pig in particular and from non-kosher foods in general. Now, among the different kinds of land animals, there is none whose flesh is so delicious as the pigs, as all who eat it agree. I think I said last time that pork was a staple of the Roman diet. And so the idea that Jews would refrain from consuming pork for Romans was incomprehensible. Where did this notion that pork is the quintessential non-kosher animal come from? It really comes from this period. And it comes from this period. Why is it that, camel isn't regarded, or the hare isn't regarded as the classic non-kosher animal? It's precisely because at this point, pork was the staple of the Roman diet. And so therefore, when Romans thought about non-kosher food, they focused particularly on pork as the food that they couldn't comprehend why Jews wouldn't eat it. Did I mention the line that Augustus said about Herod last time? I said that, right, Augustus has this line, Augustus, the first emperor, has this line about Herod where he says, better to be Herod's pig than Herod's son, because it's a pun in the Greek. Haas is pig, Hias is son, right? Hias auto repair on State Street, I assume is right. They're Greek. So better to be Haas than is Hias, because he killed his sons, but the assumption was, as a good Jewish subject, he would never actually kill a pig. So when Philo responds to this charge about non-kosher foods, he's going to also go on and in the next sentence say, among the aquatic animals, the same may be said of such species as are scaleless. But he mentions the pig in particular because that was the non-kosher food that made the least sense to a Roman audience. I'll take questions in 1 second. Let's just continue with this passage. So why is it that Jews don't eat pork? He says, in these and other restrictions, self-control was Moses's ultimate concern, and he, if anyone, had the philosophical expertise to train these with natural aptitude in the practice of virtue. He accomplishes this inculcation of self-control by training and drilling people to be sparing and easily satisfied, targeting the removal of extravagance. This idea of self-control is pivotal. There were basically 4 cardinal virtues within the Greco-Roman world that defined what it meant to lead a virtuous and happy life. Those 4 virtues were, number 1, self-control. In Greek, that's saphrosune. Number 2, justice. In the Greek, that's dikaiosune. Number 3, courage or bravery. In the Greek, that's andreia. Interesting, andreia literally means manliness. The word for man in Greek is aner. So there's a discussion among ancient thinkers, ancient Greek philosophers, about whether women are even capable of feeling bravery, right? Because this notion of bravery was specifically associated with men. And the 4th cardinal virtue is known as phronesis, or temperance. It's sort of practical wisdom that leads one to make the right decisions in all circumstances. That set of virtues was regarded as the set of virtues that defined one as leading an exemplary and virtuous life. So that when Philo says that refraining from eating pig makes one, trains one to become self-controlled, that's one of those virtues. Saphrosune, self-control. So what that means is that refraining from eating pig and from non-kosher foods in general, not only do they not make Jews different, but they actually make the Jews the best of the Greeks. In what way? Because this practice, which is unique to the Jews, was taken on by the Jews precisely because what the Jews want to do is they want to conform to this Greek virtue, right? And so therefore, not only should the Greeks not lament the fact that the Jews are different, they should actually celebrate the Jews as having these unique practices that make the Jews stand out as the best among the Greeks rather than as different from the Greeks. That's going to be the argument that Philo is going to make repeatedly. We're going to see that he makes the same claim about Shabbos, and he's going to actually say about Shabbos that Shabbos not only illustrates that one virtue about self-control or saphrosune, that Shabbos actually illustrates all four cardinal virtues. Okay, Joseph, yeah.
Different, that Jews are different is very cultural dependent. You take a current example. The United States, when the value of the United States was melting, the melting pot ethos was what everyone was interested in. Jews were very muted about their differences. No Orthodox men wore kippot. Nobody, not Russian yeshiva, wore their tzitzit. There were almost no kosher restaurants. We were quiet. Then when diversity became the ethos, when we are a strong country because of all the different cultures and all the different customs, then Jews became prouder of, and flaunt is the wrong word, I really should use a softer word, but we were proud of our differences. So it really depends on I think, or perhaps it depends in some cases on what the culture is saying about difference, and we react to that culture.
So I think that's probably true. I think that's definitely true in the modern context. In the ancient context, paganism really is a philosophy of unity. The idea is we're all one. All of us worship our local gods, but basically we're part of one larger culture. We're going to see a version of that argument a little bit later. So within that context, it was inevitable that Jewish difference was going to stand out. I think that the argument you're making is probably correct. In cultures where difference is celebrated, Jews will perhaps also be celebrated. In cultures where diversity is looked down upon, so then Jews will either conform or stand out. I think that that's right. But the important point here is that when difference is something that is condemned, Jews, to the extent that they do choose to stand out, will also be condemned. That's the important point. Okay. Is there another hand up? Okay. So let's take a look at what Philo has to say about Shabbos. Again, Philo speaking in similar terms. On this day, we are commanded to abstain from all work, not because the law inculcates slackness. It's not because what we're trying to do on Shabbos is express our laziness. That was the charge that non-Jews leveled at Jews. So it's not because we're lazy. On the contrary, it's a good thing for us to refrain from work, again, because it refreshes our ability to continue the following week. Go ahead to the fourth line. Its object is rather to give men relaxation from continuous and unending toil. So therefore, this is a good thing. Not only that, just jump ahead to the next bolded sentence. He permits the exercise of the higher activities, namely those employed in the study of the principles of virtue's lore. What are we supposed to be doing on Shabbos? On Shabbos, we are supposed to study Torah. What is Torah, according to Philo? Torah is basically an expression of these Greek virtues. And that's what he goes on to say. He says, each seventh day, there stand wide open in every city thousands of schools of, now he lists the four Greek virtues. Good sense, so that is phronesis. What I said before is really temperance. Here the translation, the next word is temperance, but that's really self-control or saphrosune. Courage, justice, and the other virtues in which the scholars sit in order quietly, with ears alert, and with full attention. So what is the point of Shabbos? Because if we're working 7 days a week, we're never going to have the time to really sit back and internalize these virtues. And so what we need to do one day out of 7 is simply sit back and study. And so therefore, Shabbos, again, should not be condemned as making Jews stand out as different. Shabbos actually should be celebrated as something that makes the Jews the best of all Greeks. And if the Jews are the only ones who observe Shabbos, then what that means is that Jews have figured out the key to these virtues, right? Really, and in that sense, if the entire world were intellectually honest, what they should do is they should actually convert to Judaism. And Philo actually says that in another passage. He says, if the non-Jews realize what we have, they realize that they discovered that we have the key to virtue, what they would do is they would basically become Jews, right? He makes that argument to such an extent, and that's really an extension of what we're seeing here. And he goes on in the rest of this passage and says, but among the vast number of particular truths and principles there studied, there stand out practically high above the others 2 main heads, one of duty to God as shown by pity and holiness, one of duty to men as shown by humanity and justice. We especially advocate specific virtues. Those specific virtues are piety, which was, I said before that there are 4 cardinal virtues. Piety in particular was one of the Roman virtues. It also was a Greek virtue. And what he's saying here is that piety is an especially important Jewish value, as are humanity, again, philanthropia and justice. Okay, so again, Jews are not different, but rather are the best of the Greeks and Romans. Okay, let's take a look at the next passage. We're turning here from Philo to a different source, and it's important for us to be moving on from Philo because what I want to make clear is that the responses that Jews made to these accusations were not limited to Philo, and they weren't limited to Philo's time period. The next source we're going to be looking at is known as 4th Maccabees. I'm not going to, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees, not our topic for now. But it's called 4th Maccabees because there are books known as 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees. 4th Maccabees is a book that was actually written in the generation following the destruction of the Second Temple. So let's call it sometime between 70 and 100 CE. It was written in Greek. The setting of the book, it's set in the persecutions of the Jews by Antiochus before the story of Hanukkah. So we have to just distinguish between the story that the book tells and when it was actually written. The story that it tells is of Antiochus's persecution of the Jews. Antiochus goes to the Jews in the year 167 and tells the Jews that if you don't eat pork and if you don't sacrifice to the gods, you're going to be killed. The story of 4th Maccabees is of Antiochus going to the Jews again and again in 167, trying to get them simply to apostatize by eating pork and by sacrificing. And again, the Jews refuse to do so. And 4th Maccabees describes their deaths in very graphic terms, describes how their limbs are torn apart, their intestines are pulled out. The idea is not simply to show that the Jews were able to resist, but that the Jews died gruesome deaths. The passage that we're looking at here is part of the earliest section of the book. This is the first time that Antiochus goes to the Jews. It's the first Jew. He goes to this elderly man and says, I don't understand why you refuse to eat pork. So let's start with the bolded section. When nature has granted it to us, why should you abhor eating the very excellent meat of this animal? It is senseless not to enjoy delicious things that are not shameful, and wrong to spurn the gifts of nature. So he speaks a number of times about nature because the argument that Antiochus here is making is that the law against eating pork, right, the laws of non-kosher food are a violation of the Stoic law of nature. Stoic law of nature is basically humanity is intended to live rationally and in harmony with the natural order itself. If you live in harmony and rationally to conform with the natural order itself, you're going to lead a happy and virtuous life. And so therefore, what Antiochus here is saying is nature is sort of defined in terms of unity. Nature is one. There aren't these discrepancies within the natural order between pig and other foods. And so therefore, it's irrational and is inconsistent with nature for Jews to refrain from eating pork, but to eating beef. And so therefore, Judaism is a non-philosophical religion that violates the natural order And therefore, what you're doing by refraining from eating non-kosher food is you are standing out. You are demonstrating your difference. We'll just finish the source and then we'll. Okay. That's the argument that Antiochus makes. The response by this Jew, whose name is Elazar, is as follows. Next paragraph, the bolded section. You scoff at our philosophy as though living by it were irrational, but it teaches us self-control so that we may master all pleasures and desires, saphrosone. It trains us in courage, the second of the Greco-Roman virtues, so that we endure any suffering willingly. It instructs us in justice, so that in all our dealings we act impartially, and it teaches us piety, so that with proper reverence we worship the only living God. Therefore, we do not eat defiling food. So far what he's said, Elazar, is he's made one argument. The first argument that he makes is that in refraining from eating non-kosher food, what we're basically doing is we are the best among the Greeks. It might be true that we alone subscribe to this set of laws, but really what you should do, if you, Antiochus, believe in this notion that there are these Greco-Roman cardinal virtues, what you should be doing is you should be celebrating our practices rather than persecuting us for them. Okay, that's the first argument. I'll just finish this passage and I'll take a question. That's the first argument that Elazar makes. The second argument that he makes, he goes on and says, for since we believe that the law was established by God, we know that the creator of the world has shown sympathy toward us in accordance with nature by giving the law. He has permitted us to eat what will be most suitable for our lives, but he has forbidden us to eat meats that would be contrary to this. The second argument is that it can't be that non-kosher foods are in some way, or that refraining from eating non-kosher foods are antithetical to this notion of natural law. And the reason for that is because we worship the creator God. And so if God brought pork into creation and God also told us to refrain from eating pork, obviously refraining from eating pork is consistent with the natural order, right? You, Antiochus, are the one who doesn't understand what nature entails, right? What the law of nature entails, what exactly the natural order requires of us. The reason that we know that our lives are lived consistently with the natural order is because we alone worship the creator God. Really what this passage in 4th Maccabees is doing is bringing together the previous two passages from Philo, namely arguing that monotheism, rather than making Jews stand out as different, actually makes Jews stand out as the best among the Greeks, number one, and number two, saying that in living their lives in accordance with halacha, what Jews really are doing is achieving the practice of these Greco-Roman virtues rather than violating them. Yeah.
Correct. That's why the reason we don't, but we just the weekend we have not much order, and it says so.
So that's not, so that's, we're going to come to a version of that argument, but that's different than what he's saying. He's not saying that we simply observe the laws of kashrus because we were told to do so. He is saying that, but the reason that we were told to do so is not simply because we were commanded, but because there are these ideals that we are supposed to be living up to, and observance of halacha is the way that we achieve those. So he's saying what you're saying, but he's going an important step beyond, and that's how he's responding to these claims by saying, basically, by turning these arguments on their head and saying, even according to your argument, you shouldn't be condemning us, you actually should be celebrating us. Right. Yeah.
Certain way is very Jewish. Take Nazir. Nazir has to bring the context at the end of Zeus. Why? I think Marshall said because he absented himself from drinking wine. God gave us wine, substitute nature for God. We have wine, you should enjoy it. So in a certain sense, that's the artist making that argument. If I were responding to the 24th century, I would grant the argument and then go on to first Maccabees' answer to the argument. But there is a certain amount of Jewish truth.
Right. I mean, Nazir is a complicated case. There, right. I mean, the Ramban and others talk about how actually it's even better. And the Ramban who said that you bring a chatas because you led the ideal life, and now you've agreed to. So the Ramban actually would agree with this and would say that Nazir is a perfect example of this. But you're right. If you read Nazir maybe differently, then you might arrive at a different conclusion. Yeah, it's an interesting counterexample. Okay, third counter argument that that Philo and others will level at their opponents touches upon this accusation that the Jews are not loyal citizens and that the Jews demonstrate dual loyalty. Remember, the example that we looked at last time is the fact that the Jews give a lot of their money to the temple in Jerusalem. That basically what they do is they amass wealth locally and then they send it out broadly. Not exactly the claim that's made in modern period and in medieval times about Jewish money, but the idea is that this demonstrates dual loyalty because they want to make money and then send it out to their co-religionists rather than keeping it local. Okay, so Philo responds to this charge in a number of places. In this first passage, he writes as follows: he knew too that they collect money for sacred purposes from their first fruits and send them to Jerusalem by persons who would offer the sacrifices. The first fruits here he's talking about is this money. Yet nevertheless, he, Augustus, neither ejected them from Rome nor deprived them of their Roman citizenship because they were careful to preserve their Jewish citizenship also, meaning Augustus doesn't say simply because you are Jews and you observe your Judaism, therefore you have to give up your Roman citizenship. He didn't do that, nor did he take away violent measures against the houses of prayers, nor prevented them from meeting to receive instructions in the laws, nor opposed their offerings of the first fruits. So the first argument that Philo is making in this passage is basically that if we look at Augustus, the Roman emperor in the end of the 1st century BCE, beginning of the 1st century CE, Augustus himself didn't oppose Jewish practice of sending money abroad to Israel. And not only that, he then goes on and turns to Augustus's successor, the Emperor Tiberius. Just look at the bolded section of the next paragraph. Tiberius did not disturb the established customs, but even to regard them as a trust committed to their care, right? What did he do? He allowed us to continue sending this money abroad. He didn't take away our right to observe our established customs, and he even regarded them as a trust committed to their care, the people as naturally peaceable, and the institutions as an influence promoting orderly conduct. Namely, what is this and other practices doing? This and other practices actually enable us to become peaceable local citizens and to uphold the civil order. And so rather than looking at this practice of sending money annually to Jerusalem as implying dual loyalty, first of all, the emperors have traditionally allowed us to do this. They recognized that this didn't demonstrate dual loyalty. And to the contrary, what Tiberius recognized is that this actually makes us stand out as good citizens, meaning we care about other people. It might be that we send this money abroad, but it's also generating a certain ethos, and that ethos is one of care, right? That ethos is one of support, and that also makes us better local citizens. That's the way in which Philo here is responding to this accusation of dual loyalty, and he says something similar in the next passage. We're going to skip this passage for now because I want to make sure that we get to the fourth section. But again, this is the way in which Philo is going to respond to this fourth accusation. Sorry, to this third accusation about dual loyalty.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's how you must say dual loyalty, right?
Yeah, correct. And that's the point.
You
Correct.
send money to-
Yeah, correct. And that's yes,
Food tax for our homes.
exactly.
We send our children to Haifa.
Correct.
Every big
That's
village.
that's exactly the point. Is these accusations have not changed over the course of 2,000 years, going back to pre-Christian, right? Okay, let's take a look at the final set of responses that we find in Josephus. We haven't mentioned Josephus today. Again, we talked about Philo in around the year 40 CE in the aftermath of that first pogrom. We talked about 4th Maccabees in the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple. Josephus is writing basically contemporary of the author of 4th Maccabees. He's going to say something a little bit different. Rather than saying that our difference actually, that talking about our difference is a misnomer and that actually difference makes us kind of achieve the very values that you celebrate, Josephus is going to make a slightly different argument. Josephus is going to say as follows. He says, Molan Apollonius. Molan Apollonius is one of these chief anti-Semites of that period, accused us of not admitting those who are in the grip of other opinions about God. Namely, he didn't allow us, Apollonius Mahlon says that we don't accept into our midst people who don't subscribe to our point of view, and of not wishing to share fellowship with those who choose to live according to a different way of life. Again, it's that claim of misanthropy. We don't accept the brotherhood of others, but even this practice is not unique to us. We're not the only ones who like to be amongst ourselves. Generally, this practice is generally common, not just to Greeks, but to the most illustrious among Greeks. The Lacedaemonians, the Spartans, used to conduct deportations of foreigners repeatedly, and also did not allow their own citizens to go abroad, suspecting in both cases that their laws would be corrupted. So don't accuse us, Jews, of somehow being exceptional in this regard. All people basically like to associate with themselves. All people, to a certain extent, will limit contact with outsiders. And so when you accuse us of being different, really you are being hypocritical. Just look amongst yourselves at the greatest of the Greeks, at the Spartans, and you'll see that we are simply we're maintaining the practices of many different societies in doing that. So we are different, but in maintaining our difference, we're no different than anyone else. Right? That's basically the argument that he's making. Difference is actually routine rather than the exception. Is the first point that Josephus makes, but he actually goes on and says something even more radical. He says, they perhaps, in 260, they perhaps might reasonably be criticized for their churlishness, for they would not grant anyone the right of citizenship. Right? When they limit contact, they basically say that limiting contact is absolute, but that's not what we do. We, on the other hand, are not inclined to emulate other people's customs, but we gladly welcome those who wish to share ours. And that would be evidence, I take it, of both benevolence and generosity. Meaning, what is it that the Spartans do? Spartans and other cultures completely limit outsiders. There is no opportunity to gain entrance to Spartan society and elsewhere. What we do, we maintain difference, just like everyone else. But if you choose to adopt our norms, we're willing to welcome you into our midst. And therefore, we actually stand out. We're different just like everyone else, but that difference only goes so far. And in allowing anyone to join our community, as long as they subscribe to our norms, we actually are demonstrating benevolence and generosity. So what Josephus is saying is, we're not going to apologize for being different, but even in being different, we're actually better than everyone else. That's basically the argument that Josephus is making. What he's really doing is, Josephus is really not undermining this argument. Really what he's doing is, Josephus is embracing difference and saying this is not something that we have to apologize for. Okay, the last passage that we're going to read, we'll do this. Technically, I have a little more than 5 minutes left because we started a little bit late. So we'll go for another 7 or 8 minutes. Let's take a look at this last passage, which is found in Avos Rabbi Nassan. Avos Rabbi Nassan, the dating of Avos Rabbi Nassan is a little bit complicated. Probably parts of it go back as early as the 3rd century. As a final edited composition, it's probably closer to the 6th century. The text that we're going to read is about Rabbi Akiva, the 2nd century Tana. It doesn't really make a difference when the work was written. The important point is understanding the claim that is being made in this text. The claim that's being made in this text is going to be different from any that we've seen until now. I'm going to read it in English just for the sake of efficiency, but feel free to follow along in the Hebrew. When Rabbi Akiva traveled to Rome, he was slandered to the governor. The governor sent him 2 beautiful women. The governor had them bathe and anoint themselves, and he adorned them like brides for their grooms. They fell upon the rabbi the entire night. This one said, "Come be with me," and that one said, "Come be with me." Right? What's the idea? The idea is the governor what was this slander? So presumably the slander was that Rabbi Akiva will not have sexual relations with non-Jewish women, right? Again, consistent with the accusations that we've seen until now. What is it that the governor is trying to do? He's sending him these 2 beautiful women, instructing them to bathe and anoint themselves precisely because he wants them to seduce Rabbi Akiva. And that's what they say. One of them says, come be with me. The other says, come be with me. And this is what takes place the entire night. But he sat between them and spat and did not look at them. The next morning, they went and complained to the governor. They said, death is preferable to us than to be given to a man like that. He, the governor, summoned Rabbi Akiva and said to him, why do you not do with these women as is customary for men to do with women? Are they not beautiful? Are they not human beings like you? Did he who created you also not create them? That argument that the governor is making is the same argument that we saw Antiochus make, namely that it's defying the natural order for Jews only to have relations with Jews. There shouldn't be a difference, the governor is saying, between Jews and non-Jews. And so therefore, in refusing to have relations with these two non-Jewish women, Rabbi Akiva really is defying the natural order, right? He is violating natural law, which makes him stand out in a really objectionable way. That's the argument that the governor is making after Rabbi Akiva spent the whole night resisting these two women. He, Rabbi Akiva, said to him as follows, and this is the key passage. What can I do? For their stench came upon me from carrion, from unkosher food and reptiles, right? So in the passage in Avos to Rabbi Nassan, this is mibasar neveilot utrefot umibasar shratzim. The parallel passage in Psikta de Rav Kahana, which is probably a 5th or 6th century midrashic work, has the same story, but it concludes not by talking about nevela, trefa, and shratzim, but rather their stench came upon me like that of carrion and swine, of nevelot and basar chazir. So what is Rabbi Akiva responding? Rabbi Akiva is not responding that we are just like you. He's not celebrating the fact that the Jews are just like Gentiles. What Rabbi Akiva is doing is he's leaning into difference. He's saying we are different from you, and we're not going to run away from that. We are different from you, and that's fine, right? We presumably subscribe to the norms that were introduced by the Creator God. He doesn't talk about the Creator God, but again, if he's responding to the charge that is being leveled by this governor, the governor says, are they not human beings like you? Did he who created you also not create them? Rabbi Akiva would say, yes, God created them just like he created Jewish women, but that is the God that commanded us to stay away from non-Jewish women. He's leaning into difference, not apologizing for it at all. Why does he talk about the stench coming from non-kosher meat? So just to give an illustrative example, what's the idea here is that non-kosher meat became for Jews disgusting. Think about the stench that emanates from a cheeseburger. It becomes, it's sort of we have sort of like a revulsion, natural revulsion. The halacha is that if a person is in need of is in need of food on Shabbos, you can't force him to eat non-kosher food because he's not going to be able to consume that non-kosher food. He's naturally going to vomit it up. Why will he vomit it up? He will vomit it up because he's not going to be able to hold it down. He's going to be so disgusted by the non-kosher food that better for you to go on Shabbos to shecht kosher meat than to actually give him non-kosher meat, which is more accessible. Precisely for this reason, what Rabbi Akiva is saying is non-kosher meat has for us become so disgusting that when I think about having relations with non-Jews, having relations with non-Jews is reflexively disgusting to me. And it's reflexively disgusting because we are fundamentally different, Rabbi Akiva is saying, and we're simply not going to apologize for that. Rabbi Akiva's response is very different from anything that we've seen until now, whereas the other writers, Josephus, Philo, 4th Maccabees, all said, you think that we're different, but our difference really actually makes us equal to or superior to you. Actually, difference does make us stand out, and we're not going to apologize for that. We'll stop here. I'm happy to answer questions. We'll stop, and I'm not running anywhere, so feel free to come forward and answer questions. I will see everybody hopefully back in December and January. In the meantime, everyone have a great summer.